Welcome to Journey of an Aesthete podcast for one of our ongoing book lunches. It's a series I inaugurated about a year ago, I suppose, in which we feature a single book. And I'm really delighted for a couple of reasons on this particular book lunch. One is that we're discussing one of my favorite books, Marcel Gauchet, The Disenchantment of the World, A Political History of Religion, which I believe was written and published in the 80s originally, correct? Mid-1980s. And above all, we have a scholar and expert, a returning guest, Michael Behrent, who was here recently to discuss Michelfoucault, and now we're going to discuss Marcel Gauchet and this really, I have to say, I really love this book. I'm even more impressed with this book than Karen Armstrong or Elaine Pagels, as great as those two folks are. And this seems to me somewhat different. I've never read a book. And speaking personally, I just reread it this week, actually. I've never read a book about religious history as interesting as this one and as thought-provoking. So, Michael, where do you want to begin? There's a lot to talk about. I know you wrote an article for Dissent magazine on Gauchet, right? And I know that you teach him, and if you're fortunate enough also to have read his in French, his multi-volume, what is it, Democracy, or what is it? Is that what it was?
Yes, he's written a 4-volume work on sort of the contemporary history of democracy. That's right.
And you're involved in that. Is there anything you wanted to start with and talking about Gauchet and this book, or it's your choice which direction you want to go in, of course. But
well, you should absolutely lead the conversation, obviously. But I guess maybe one place to start is just to try to say a little bit about who Gauchet is, and to sort of try to situate him in intellectual life. I mean, he's an interesting figure. I would definitely say that he is, whatever this means, a prominent French writer, philosopher, intellectual. Mm-hmm. He, just a few things about him. I mean, he is in some ways an academic, or someone who's had a career as an academic. I think he's retired now. But his trajectory is a somewhat atypical one. He first of all is born in the post-war years in rural France, in Normandy. Tries to go the route of becoming a teacher, but gets caught up in the sort of heady politics of France in the 1960s.
Swanson retard, right? Would that be the?
Yes, that's right. Except, but with the interesting fact that at least some of that activism is actually not done in Paris, but in a more rural environment, which makes it quite interesting. Not a rural environment, but a provincial environment in the French understanding, meaning not in Paris. And I do think that he's someone who, while he is an original thinker, and I very much think he is an original thinker, is someone who's sort of cultivated their originality by drawing creatively on the work of other thinkers. I always think of that T.S. Eliot line that, good poets imitate, or bad poets imitate, great poets steal, and there's a little bit of that kind of element in Gauchet. He's very, very influenced by two thinkers who were associated with a dissident Marxist group in France that actually is quite intellectually prominent, called Socialism or Barbarism, Socialisme ou Barbarie. And these are two really interesting thinkers, sort of known to connoisseurs, but not necessarily kind of more broadly known, a little bit more so in France, claudelefort and corneliuscastoriadis. Gauchet studied with Lefort at the University of Caen in Normandy, and his sort of interest in political thought, and especially the history of democracy, is crucially shaped by Lefort, even if at later points they disagreed. Just a couple of other things that I think are worth mentioning is that even though that suggests a fairly radical lineage, because Lefort and Castoriadis were interested in sort of shifting from kind of Marxism to a theory of radical democracy, it is also noteworthy that Gauchet becomes involved in a kind of rediscovery of political liberalism and the idea of democracy in the 1970s, in a context in which those ideas are seen as being sort of quite critical of the Marxist tradition that many so-called 68ers, many of the 60s radicals had embraced. So it is worth, and in this context, another sort of figure that he kind of fixes his star to is, and by the way, Lefort and Castoriadis and those guys are all involved in this as well, is François Furet, the historian of the French Revolution, who was famous for developing this non-Marxist account of the French Revolution that sort of emphasizes the French Revolution as a moment in the development of democracy and a kind of problematic moment in the development of democracy, rather than emphasizing the Marxist account of class struggle and bourgeois revolution and so on. So from the outset, Gauchet's project, sort of two things. First of all, it is he comes to religion because of his concern with politics, and that is absolutely essential, I think, to understanding this book. And second of all, I don't want to say that this is kind of a anti-Marxist screed, but there is it definitely comes in a context in which a certain kind of generation is trying to think of alternatives to Marxism. And that fact alone sort of situates Gauchet in a very distinct place in French intellectual politics. So that's sort of key to the background of the book, I would say.
Well, thank you. I mean, he opens up his text in the introduction talking about the distance between us, we moderns, and older societies, and he says they took the initiative where we would today be passive. And conversely, they were passive where we take the initiative. That there's this kind of, and he's also very adamant. He's responding to the notion that there is this unvarying religious function. He says, I don't accept this notion of a religious function that does not vary. So he's letting you know that this is a history of discontinuity, and Judeo-Christianity ushers in something totally new in human life, right? And that's very exciting. He lays it very clear in his own language. Is that a good starting point? Because that's how he starts his.
I think that's a good starting point. I mean, just maybe one other kind of just sort of a few other sort of quick sort of introductory points, even to sort of flesh out those points, which I think you're absolutely crucial to, which are absolutely crucial, and you're absolutely right to emphasize. First of all, this is the genre in which Gauchet is writing is a peculiar one, and not one that the late 20th century or the 21st centuries are particularly well known for, which is the philosophy of history. This is an enormously big picture book. This is a book that tries to explain how it all fits together. It's a history of the world, and it argues that there is a basic story, a basic grand narrative that connects the history of the world. And this is not a popular or well-accepted approach to thinking about history, whether in politics or in history or in philosophy. It's strongly associated with earlier thinkers like Hegel and
their kind of a little bit.
Yeah, perhaps,
but I don't know. Well, I'm glad. I'm very happy that you interjected that, because that makes it unusual. But it's his claims are very language, and go ahead. I mean, there's probably more to say about that. But
so I guess the question then is there's a lot going on in this book, and there's many kind of specific and interesting arguments. But everything fits together for Gauchet, or at least that's the gambit for him, is to sort of show how things fit together. Another phrase that I think about is this one that was popularized by the British political philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who talks about hedgehogs, divides thinkers into hedgehogs and foxes, right? And it's from this line. Yes. So the idea, just for the viewers, is that the how does it go? The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And it's, and the idea is that there are certain thinkers who are interested in kind of the diversity of the world and the way thought that can approach that, whereas there's others who are looking for how everything fits together. Gauchet is very much of a kind of classic example of a hedgehog in that sense. Yeah. So then the question is, if you're playing this game, what's the story you want to tell? And I think that has to kind of be the starting point. And to me, the sort of now you're absolutely right also, and we have to talk about this, that he makes a crucial argument about the role that Christianity plays in world history. But I think that to understand that point, you have to go back a little bit further to sort of his crucial argument, which is to say, I mean, yes, he has this idea that there's multiple forms of religion, as you said, but he kind of tries to argue that there is one sort of pure form of religion, and everything else is kind of a sort of watering down of it, and the pure form is primitive religion, and the way that I would just sort of describe before we have to talk about like what he means by primitive religion.
Right. There's a lot of disclaimers in his text, right?
But the story of the book is, I almost kind of like think about it as kind of like a Big Bang kind of type argument, that the starting point is primitive religion, and then there's a moment at which primitive religion kind of is abandoned or sort of blows up, and that sort of propulsive force of what happens when you blow up that initial framework is really the driving force of history, in a sense, for Gauchet. And he calls this process not secularization, but in French, now I'm forgetting the exact phrase, but the departure from religion. La sortie de la religion.
Exit from religion. Well, the exit from religion, right?
The exit from religion. Thank you. That's the translation.
Christianity to him is the religion to leave religion. Yeah,
that's right. So the key thing to understand about Christianity is, by the time we get to Christianity, we're already in the process of leaving religion. This is the kind of unusual argument that I mean, it's not that unusual. People have made versions of this, but he has his own sort of take on this. So, I mean, to me, the sort of key thing then is, what does he mean by this idea of primitive religion, and why is everything else a kind of ongoing attempt to sort of extract ourselves from that sort of initial framework? And his key idea is that it is a form or a way of structuring society and structuring the world. Right. And I think this is a particularly sort of intriguing and point and just sort of crucial to the overall argument, which is that what primitive religion is, and he has in mind, I mean, again, the criticism is like, what exactly does he have in mind? Does he actually have something concrete in mind? But he has something in mind like the kind of belief systems of early hunter-gatherer societies. I mean, that's kind of what he's talking about, I mean, pre-Egyptian, pre-Mesopotamian, and all that. And his claim is that primitive religion is a kind of collective choice by human beings to say that they have no ability to understand or interpret the world in which they live. We have nothing to do with this world. We have nothing to do with its ultimate purpose, its ultimate meaning. That's all the gods. We have nothing to do with it. There's a phrase that he uses in one of his early essays when he's formulating this, where he calls it a debt of meaning. In terms of meaning, we are not creditors. We're not people who are sort of creating it. We are debtors. We get it from someone else.
Right. It's passed on from tradition in a way, where there's some kind of founding tradition.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
You have to sort of accept this, and you also have to sort of accept this idea that according to Gauchet, that this means that that all this happened before us, right?
That's right.
We have no agency, no role in how this
happened,
came about.
It's before we came here.
Interpret it. It just exists. And I think that what interests Gauchet about this, and look, on strictly empirical grounds, there's all kinds of ways you can challenge this. So it's more sort of, what does Gauchet do with this argument that I think is kind of the interesting part. And the sort of paradox, and he's also a thinker who loves a paradox. That the paradox of this argument is that it is a deliberate human choice,
right?
Say that humans have no choice about how the world works,
right.
And that I think is crucial. Like that, this
absolutely. It's like we chose not to choose. We chose not to choose.
That's right.
We chose not to choose for some kind of other functioning of society. Well, as he puts it, and this is very, of course, not just him. This is a very popular understanding. The one, sort of total unity and oneness and so on, right? And that's kind of that world. It's such as he.
That's right. It's a certain conception of oneness. I mean, the way that I think about it, it's kind of like, this debt of meaning idea is that, we sort of, human beings kind of create this sort of structure, but then they sort of throw away the key, they claim not to have the key to interpreting this world. And something else that I think is sort of quite important from this. And by the way, there's a interesting French anthropologist, another huge influence on Gauchet that he kind of like takes this argument from, is this guy Pierre Clastres, who wrote this book called Society Against the State. Yeah, right. And the argument is that primitive religion is a deliberate attempt to avoid having a state, okay, and specifically to avoid a certain kind of politics. And this is something very counterintuitive about Gauchet's argument, but very important to it, which is that sort of the opposite of religion, understood in its pure form as primitive religion for Gauchet, is not atheism or secular society, it's politics, okay? What primitive religion does, by saying that human beings have no agency, no autonomy, to use another term that he likes to use, even if it's in this paradoxical gesture of actually displaying a certain kind of autonomy in the very choice to do this, what it is saying is no individual in this society has the kind of authority to interpret the society, and in the same gesture to assume power. So it's a deliberate attempt to kind of create an egalitarian society by denying the existence of sort of priestly kings who could invoke religion to interpret it. So so there's this kind of interesting sort of egalitarianism, but also no state, really no politics as we understand them. And also, this is very important to Gauchet, no history, because you only have history once you have a conception of that humans can actually make a difference in the course of events. So
that's what makes the appearance of the Christ so deeply important for him. Almost one of the impressive things about this book is that, again, I know it's written by, as Charles Taylor reminds us in the preface, by a non-believer. This book could have been written by a believer in a way. There's a strange sense, right? Because it gives so much credit to this revolution of Christ, and that's when you enter into history, right? Really, kind of agency, right? Kind of,
I think that's right. I think there's one other thing that you need, which he talks about in the chapter after primitive religion, which is the state, right? Which he strangely calls a religious revolution. And the idea of and again, the state and Christianity to him, I think, are very, very closely connected, strangely. But the idea for Gauchet is that what happens with the invention of the state is, this is the slightly kind of obscure part of his argument, but he does sort of make these arguments that you move from a different way of having divisions in society. Under primitive religion, the division is between sort of us and the gods, but also between the
beyond
and
the here. What's he saying? Here below and beyond, right? The here below.
That's right. That's right.
Beyond. And then there's a shift, and it becomes
But what happens with the state, and here I think he really has in mind, I don't know, and this is far from my expertise, but things like, the emergence of sort of priestly kings, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Mesoamerica, and so on. And the argument is that what happens at this point is when you start to have individuals who claim to act in the name of God, something very interesting happens, which is that you have a social structure that recognizes the existence and legitimacy of human agency. And this is the funny thing about the emergence of kind of like these sort of great powerful gods. He has this line that he loves mentioning in here, and this is again important for Christianity. It's something along the lines of, the greater the gods, the more powerful or the more free humans are. Strangely enough, it's precisely the kind of little nature gods that you have in sort of primitive religion. And again, I apologize to all the anthropologists out there, because I'm sure this is extremely sort of basic and probably wrong. But for Gauchet, the idea is that when you have, a world sort of, literally what Max Weber meant when he talked about the enchantment of the world, the kind of idea that nature is sort of infused with spiritual forces and all that. That's actually the more constraining form of religion. And it's meant to be that way for Gauchet. Strangely, it's when you start to have the development of these powerful, what he calls transcendent sort of divinities, that this kind of gives human beings a sort of purchase on their own fate, in a sense. And this is precisely what interests him.
Right, because that leads that's the modern democratic, right? That leads to modern democracy and things like that, right?
Down the road, it sort of takes a little while to get there.
It takes a long time. It takes wars and shooting and violence and.
No, I think that's right, and it has something to do. And so like you said, this has to do with his kind of peculiar conception of Christianity as, there's a lot that he says about the significance of Christianity, but he basically thinks that the ultimate historical significance of Christianity is that it becomes this spiritual, intellectual framework that clears the path for human agency. Okay, which is a peculiar argument. Christians might say that Christianity is important for any kind of number of reasons, salvation and even the sort of city of man, having a kind of ethical basis and so on. Atheists might sort of see it as kind of the reign of illusion and so on like that. But, Gauchet's, sort of paradoxical sort of argument is that that Christianity gives human beings a kind of purchase on
life,
on the world. And, partly because he says, like, the very idea of the incarnation lends itself to interpretation. It's about how do we make sense of this.
Right. And then gives us powers of interpreters.
Yes, I definitely think that is part of it. Right.
Powers to be, in some sense, decision makers.
That's right.
Notwithstanding whether we tell ourselves as decision makers that it isn't ultimately our decision. It's an interesting, that's the paradox. It's a little bit like surrender to accomplish something, right? It's a little like to accomplish
phrase,
something.
By the way, I want to underline that, because that's surrender to accomplish something. I think is that kind of thinking is central to Gauchet's argument. Yes. And part of its kind of mystery and peculiar nature is in many different instances, that sort of kind of structure of surrendering to accomplish something is the sort of thing that he is interested in.
It makes total sense to me. But of course, I'm biased. I like the book. I like his argument. I like the way he writes. But yet it has its detractors. I mean, did you want to, is it too early to get into that? Or is there anything, I'm sorry, do you want anything more you want to say?
No, I mean, I think that's right. And that maybe also helps us sort of talk about some of the sort of later arguments in the book. Mm-hmm. I mean, let me just, a few sort of quick comments. I mean, I think that he, he has this sort of whole argument about the development of the absolute state as being of something that you get to down the road from Christianity, and he also sort of believes that, in a sense, kind of democracy, strangely, is always kind of just sort of the next shoe dropping once you have the absolutist state, because fundamentally what the absolutist state is about is an argument about human autonomy, right? There's the minor issue that is just one guy who has all the authority.
Right. It's very like
it's interesting that it's interesting that in Gauchet's argument that's not as important,
Well, because he's not looking at the initial. He's not only looking at the initial tyranny of such a state of affairs. In those, you have this overweening, all-powerful absolutist Leviathan, right? Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, and he's saying, don't stay focused on that. He's saying, look what it leads to. Look at its undoing, right? Or look at the challenge to it. It's interesting, yeah.
And he also says, I mean, the sort of specific historical argument that he makes in there is, that as soon as you have the sort of first theorists of the absolutist state, you immediately have social contract theory, because because everybody sort of gets that fundamentally what you're talking about with the absolutist state is some kind of that really sort of what you're doing is kind of authorizing a human role in history or something like that. And here's something else that I think is, I think maybe we should mention this briefly, and then we can start talking a little bit about the criticisms if you'd like. But I mean, I think it's very, very interesting that a crucial argument that he makes in this book is that a major part, and maybe the major part of this process of exiting religion, that propulsive force that happens after we leave the primitive religion
and enter into history
is the development of subjectivity. Okay, and by the way, this ties in a lot to other French debates from the time. It ties into the interests of, you mentioned Charles Taylor having written the introduction. Charles Taylor has also written a lot about modern subjectivity. And and what kind of interests Gauchet is the, I think his chapter is called something like Figures of the Subject,
That's right.
and he's interested in sort of the different ways in which subjectivity kind of becomes a sort of theme in human culture, in this process of kind of leaving religion. So one of those forms is the state and the figure of the monarch, because this is the sort of underlying connection between the absolutist state and modern democracy, which on the face of it looks kind of absurd. But his argument is, that they are both sort of arguments about there being an entity within society that ultimately directs and pilots it and seeks to master it. And one way to think about that is an absolute monarch, but a democratic sovereign expressing itself through elections and an assembly and so on could be another way to think about it. I also think it's very interesting that he gets into this argument about individual subjectivity as something that sort of starts to kind of matter a lot in this time period, and he sees these as kind of closely connected. I think that this kind of desire to be autonomous individually is something that we see in sort of, culture in the early modern period, whether it's the Enlightenment, whether it's in sort of conceptions of relationships, whether it's in the idea of artistic expression, but it's also something that you see in the sort of social and political level with these various kind of attempts to sort of make arguments for how human beings kind of run society. And to go back to your point, which I think is crucial about sort of surrendering oneself to achieve something. It's a little bit like, help me remember this, but I'm gonna mangle this, but the moment in the Odyssey where Odysseus, I think, has to sort of bind himself in a certain way when he's going through Scylla and Charybdis in order to be able to sort of pilot the ship and not be drowned, right? So again, that kind of structure, I think, sort of recurs repeatedly in this book. And one quote that I read, and again, he can be kind of obscure at times. This is on page 172 of the translation that I was thinking about as I was at least rereading parts of this in the context of our conversation. He says, actually, we are still scarcely in a position to know what the fully developed subject form would be like. What we can clearly discern is that it would be far removed from the traditional idea of subjectivity and its assumed prerequisites. Much ground remains to be explored if we are to understand the operating conditions of a being for itself, endowed with thought, which simultaneously only exists through itself. I'm skipping a little bit. Briefly, what could lay the foundation for the existence of something like an autonomous self? Concepts for thinking about post-religious man do not yet exist. So here's what I think he's saying here. Very to sort of really kind of distill this, because I know it's fancy French philosophy, but is that he's trying to say, I think, that fundamentally the very idea of subjectivity, the very idea of an entity that calls itself I and that thinks of itself as purely capable of self-action is actually a very confusing and obscure and mysterious concept. And here's the reason why, is because most of the time subjectivity can only develop in confrontation with its opposite. We and it's in some ways a sort of basic idea. We only experience all the aspects that we we associate with subjectivity, such as, I don't know, freedom, thinking for oneself, and so on. When according to Gauchet, when we confront other forces that would deny us that, and so and I think that he sort of sees and what he's and this is why religion matters, because what he is trying to say is that what interests Gauchet fundamentally is the emergence of politics and democratic politics and the kind of individual subjectivity that's connected to it. But his argument is we can only understand those efforts insofar as they are attempts to kind of wrest that autonomy from the thing that we are sort of hardwired to set up as a contrast to it, or as an obstacle to it, which is religion. And so so I think, again, just and I think this sort of has a lot to do with his idea of democracy, because I think what he sees democracy as doing is kind of blending, in a sense, a certain kind of individual claim to freedom with a collective exercise of power, but that does, in a funny kind of way, hark back to this kind of religious idea of the collective. So here's the issue. Gauchet is fundamentally trying to make an argument for the spiritual, if you will, significance of human autonomy, and sees democratic politics as the ultimate expression of that.
Absolutely.
But it only is effective and only clear when it has a clear obstacle that it is resisting. And I think that what's happened. So beginning in sort of the 80s and 90s, Gauchet started writing for this journal that he's associated with these pieces that are kind of pieces of cultural criticism, in which he is seen as kind of being very critical of contemporary individualism in various forms. And I think his argument is basically, when we don't have religion and its various kind of stand-ins for religion, which could be things like conservative social institutions or something like that. When we don't have those to resist anymore, we get lost. And so we have autonomy, but without the understanding of autonomy that comes when we are resisting religion and religious-like things. So this is the paradox of Gauchet, because he wants to be a liberal.
You need something to fight against, to have a thing to actually be a subject to fight.
That's right.
Or be a subject of any kind, right? I mean, I think
that's right. And he thinks that basically we get confused when we try to create that sort of purely autonomous self, without that sort of foil to construct it. And what this means in practice is, in terms of like these specific interventions that Gauchet makes, and I'm not an expert in these and I haven't looked deeply into them, but it means that he is sort of quite critical of, or at least skeptical about, sort of the coherence of what he sees as extreme forms of individualism. And you can, I don't know, you or maybe the viewers sort of see where this is going. So certain forms of feminism sort of become sort of examples of this, certain forms of I don't want to say gay rights exactly, but there's a whole sort of debate in France about gay civil unions in the 90s, or same-sex civil unions in the 90s, and then same-sex marriages. And Gauchet's sort of view, I mean, I'm not sure, but I could be wrong, that he ever actually says like we shouldn't do those things. But I think that he believes that they kind of lose their coherence when there is a kind of, I don't know, sort of, project for individual autonomy and emancipation that doesn't, have these kind of collective forces that it kind of, is invigorated by opposing or something like that,
Yeah.
And
I mean, I'm quite comfortable. I'm uncomfortable with those views of his. I mean, what I mean is that I'm perfectly willing to accept that a guy could write a book as remarkable as this book and still be wrong about a great many things, and it's not. Yeah, just that's a given for me. If he is wrong about things, right? So he's not a saint, and he's not ready. So it's interesting, and even. Well, his partner is Gladysswain, right? Is that correct? Or?
Yes, and she's passed away a long time ago, actually.
Okay, well, that's very sad. But didn't they, as a couple, argue with Foucault over empirical issues of prisons and conditions of prison? Wasn't there? Is that too far off topic, or is that?
No, it's.
Yeah.
Again, going back to that hedgehog idea, what's interesting about Gauchet is there's really no argument in him that doesn't sort of more or less quickly get back to the arguments of this book, The Disenchantment of the World. And this is what I think is it kind of can give one pause about those sort of cultural positions that he's making, because he is trying to say that when we get so sort of far in this kind of disintegrating process of exiting religion, that we don't have this kind of religious foil anymore, that we get a bit lost. And so he would try and connect those arguments even to this book. And then what you're referring to is actually an earlier book. But although I do believe that, interestingly, it was published in the same series as
Madness and Democracy. Is that it?
Yes, and in French it's called La pratique de l'esprit humain, which sort of roughly translates as the practice of the human mind. Wow. And really and it's published in 1980, and it is co-authored by Gauchet, and I don't know if she was his wife or partner, but gladysswain, who was a psychiatrist, I believe, and they wrote a number of pieces together. And what's interesting is that two things. First of all, even though it is kind of a history of madness and asylums, it is also sort of you very much sort of see the attempts by Gauchet to sort of connect that history to a history of democracy. And then secondly, it's anti-Foucault.
Right.
Now, it's really its criticism is not so much the prison book, Discipline and Punish, as Madness and Civilization, the first big book, L'histoire de la folie à l'âge classique, Folie et des raisons, and basically, he says Foucault gets it exactly wrong, right? And
that's why I'm glad we did this follow up to our last episode, because we want to have point counterpoint. We want to have balance and sort of different.
Basically, he says, Foucault makes this, famous argument that what happens to madness in modern times is that it becomes something that is excluded, and that's the way that we should understand what the invention of the insane asylum is. In the late 18th, early 19th century. Previously, madness had sort of, even if it was viewed as taboo and religiously problematic in various ways, it was nonetheless, Foucault argued, kind of woven into society. And at a certain point, it gets excluded, and the insane asylum is kind of the sort of concrete form that exclusion takes. Without getting into all of Foucault's argument, Gauchet and Swain say it's exactly the opposite. That the way to understand what modern psychiatry is, and by extension, psychiatric hospitals and asylums and so on, is precisely an attempt to. These institutions are precisely aimed at inclusion. They specifically use the term inclusion to contrast it to exclusion. And in a sense, kind of what their argument is that what psychiatric institutions are trying to do is this. They say the mad have lost their reason, have lost their autonomy. They have become, I'm not sure that they say this, but this is sort of the sort of gist of it, to connect it to Disenchantment. The gist of it is the mad have kind of become religious again, you might say, because they have lost the capacity for autonomy. And so the purpose of psychiatric institutions is to reintegrate them into society by coming up with all these strategies for getting them to be autonomous individuals again, through socializing them, through trying to sort of, sort of smoke out the reason that is seen as alienated and things like that. So their argument is that actually the development of psychiatric institutions is a sort of major part of this kind of of sort of the culture, if you will, of democratic societies, which are basically kind of anchored on the idea of the achievement of autonomy. Foucault totally ignored the book. Foucault never said it. It came out in 1980, so he was still alive, and he.
Oh yeah. Well, I really enjoyed this. And of course, this is what he's done recently. This little thing on Robespierre, but I don't know.
Yeah, which I have not read.
But I don't want to get into all that now. But is there anything before we conclude that you want to say in addition to about religion or this history or Gauchet today, or is there?
Well, I think that I mean he's I mean this in kind of a good way. He's a bit of an oddball as a thinker, because no one really likes philosophy of history, or at least it has a kind of bad reputation among academics. Let me put it that way.
Okay. So that's part of the criticism thing. It's sort of fallen out of favor what he's doing. I imagine it has two groups of foes. I imagine the sort of scientific history or natural science oriented history really dislikes it because it's too speculative and I imagine them saying it's a form of charlatanism and the just so story, but probably it has foes among continental radical who are themselves also anti-empirical because it's too conservative or something, or too I'd imagine they would say that it's too top down, too reductionist. I don't know. Is that fair? Is that kind of the?
I think that's right. And I also think that I think that's exactly right. And clearly the big sort of beef that people have with Gauchet is there's a kind of, I mean, for one of a better term, a kind of leftist element in French intellectual politics that that doesn't like this guy being the sort of person who gets to talk about democracy all the time because they think he's essentially kind of a conservative. And there's some, there's some truth to that, but the interesting thing.
Hold that thought. When you say there's truth to that, are you informed by the alainbadoi Gauchet debate? Did that come out in that debate? Because it's fairly recent, right? Mid 2000s, and was that?
Yeah.
And Baudois, of course, is the left, right? He was after Roy.
But Gauchet will say that he's philosophically socialist, right?
That's
I mean, so but he's not.
He's not a conservative.
He's not a communist. I mean, Badiou still identifies with a certain kind of communism. Gauchet does not do that.
That itself is just an enormous difference. I mean, because Baudois is actually has not de-Stalinized, maybe, or not Maoist. He's not. Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, it's hard to.
But I think it also.
Funny.
I mean, first of all, there's an issue of intellectual style, which is, that, I mean, Gauchet is not someone who is, primarily focused on using intellectual work to support the emancipatory projects of particular groups, right? I mean, that's I mean, and there's plenty of intellectuals in the world and in France, who do think that is what the task should be. And Gauchet doesn't see himself that way. There's also a complaint that he talks to politicians too much. That there's, I think this is true, but I've never actually sort of done the history on it. There's an argument that Jacqueschirac, of all people, of all the sort of, conventional politicians you can imagine, in 1995 sort of used this campaign slogan that originated with Gauchet. So there's stuff like that. But I think the issue in a sense is deeper, which is, it has to do with his actual philosophical claims, which I do think are interesting, and it goes back to that sort of, line that you used earlier about sort of surrender. I mean, there is this idea in Gauchet that the modern idea of subjectivity and the idea of autonomy, the idea of self-legislation, that
self-legislation.
I have the ability to run my own life. That there is an idea. I actually think a lot of this is kind of rooted in psychoanalysis. That is a puzzling and confused concept. I mean, just briefly. If Freud, with Sigmund Freud, and especially some of his French followers, like the notorious French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, the whole idea is the way that we become a person, a subject who, according to Freud, accepts the idea of the reality principle is by the renunciation of instinctual desire and the identification with a certain kind of authority figure, the so-called father figure. And Jacques Lacan, the father figure, becomes what he calls the symbolic order, language as such. But the idea is that, the way that we actually kind of become functioning selves is through that very task of surrender that you just described, right? Like through now we can't over-identify with authority, because that makes us messed up in other ways. But there is this idea that this sort of strange gesture. It's like when I give up on the idea that I simply will just try and realize and satisfy all of my instinctual needs, but identify with a kind of structure, that's when I become an actual subject. And I do, and I think that I think that some version of that argument runs very, very deep in Gauchet, and that he extends it to understanding democracy. And a key point here, I think, is and this almost sort of ties into more almost sort of classic political philosophy debates, is sort of the connection between how in democracy do individual rights fit in with sort of the collective exercise of authority. Right. Yeah, and I think this is something that Gauchet is very, very concerned with. I think to me, the force of those individualistic essays or critiques of individualism that he's writing in the 80s and 90s is to say everybody kind of wants individual rights, but people are losing this kind of sense of the importance of participating in politics and civic activism. I mean, you could say that he's kind of a very fancy sort of French philosophical take on someone like Robert Putnam, who has the bold
I mean, guy.
People, Putnam's problem.
It's also similar to Christopher Lasch, and
yes, he's totally Christopher Lasch. I mean, there's a French scholar who says that Gauchet's problem is that he's actually he likes Christopher Lasch too much, and I think I think he is very much that type.
Have they met?
Did they meet each other, Lasch and Gauchet, ever? Do you know if they crossed?
I don't think so.
No.
Gauchet also apparently doesn't travel much. He's a
little bit like Eric Romer in that sense. Or maybe he has a fear, right? Eric Romer had a fear of flying, didn't he?
That's really? Yeah, I'm not sure Gauchet takes many trains either, but I don't know that. I have heard people.
Yeah.
I've heard people say that, but the Putnam idea that, well, okay, people still bowl, but they're not bowling in bowling leagues anymore.
That's right.
And when people don't bowl in bowling leagues, there's something that gets lost, this kind of social capital thing. I actually do think that is a significant part of what Gauchet is getting at, and he kind of he puts it on a little bit more sort of philosophical steroids, but it's some version of that idea, like that when we try to kind of just strike out on our own, there is something that we lose, not just in the sense of a collective, but we lose the element of collective life and a sense of otherness and transcendence that actually is crucial to the development of our very individuality and subjectivity. So it's kind of like a mistake to sort of become too much of an individual because you lose the resources for being an individual, something like that.
That's right. Well, that's I'm very excited with this episode, and I think we covered a lot in a timely fashion. And I want to wish you bon voyage. You're going to France this week.
Merci. Thank you.
Safe travels, and thank you for your generosity in covering, I think, an underrated thinker, Marcel Gauchet. I think he's not classifiable as conservative, of course, even though some say he is.
Sure.
I think he's his own man, as they used to say, own person.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would just say he's worth looking into. He's an interesting figure. He's a little bit, as I think this conversation shows, he's a little bit difficult to explain. There's
Yes.
there's a lot of complexity in his thought, but I do think he actually is someone who's talking about the world and has interesting things to say.
Yes, and in that complexity, he's very French. He's a very guy, you could say. Well, thank you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.